I've got my Bible, and I've got my brew. Let's talk resistance and the Zealots.
Attention, attention. Stay tuned for an incoming transmission.
This is Radio Free Ecclesia, the pirate radio broadcast to the citizens of God's kingdom living in enemy-occupied territory. As we look around, it seems like we're seeing a rise in the use of violence as a form of protest and as a mechanism of social and political change. But this is not anything new. Violence has been around for eons as a way for people to try to exert force and to leverage their desire to bring about change. In fact, violence was something that was being employed by some of God's own people at the time of Jesus. These people were called the Zealots. And so I want to look at them as an example of resistance. And like we did with the Sadducees, try to determine if we can learn anything from them to inform our own resistance as the people of God today. The Zealots were the polar opposite of the Sadducees. Whereas the Sadducees embraced collaboration as a way of maintaining their status and their place under the Roman occupation, the Zealots went to the opposite extreme and embraced armed military resistance. They believed that that was the path forward for them to not only have freedom, but to be able to practice their faith and their covenant faithfulness to God. Now, their belief was something that was grounded in their own history. Around 200 years before the time of Jesus' public ministry, the Israelites, the Jews, took up arms against the previous occupational regime, the Greeks. They were led by a priest named Mattathias and his sons, and this family came to be known as the Maccabees, which was the nickname of the eldest son, Judas Maccabee, from the name or the word Maccabeus, which means hammer. And so he was known as Judas the Hammer, a great name for a military leader. And Judas and his brothers were able to lead the Jews in victory over the Greeks, who were the world power of that time. And for a brief period, the Jews had freedom and autonomy. For the first time since the Babylonian captivity, they were not living under an occupying regime. But unfortunately, this didn't last very long. And as we know, they came under the power of the Romans. But this memory of this victory lived on in the popular consciousness of the Jews of Jesus' time. And many believed that if God was with them and if they were faithful to God, God would once again give them a military victory over their enemies and restore their independence and their freedom again. In the decades leading up to Jesus' time and in the decades to follow, from time to time, a military insurrection would flare up among the Jews, and a group of men would gather together and fight against the Romans. Almost every single time, they were put down as quickly as they rose up. The Romans were ruthless in their suppression of any kind of armed revolt. In fact, sometimes they would go so far as to crucify the survivors of the military insurrection. But this happened many times before Jesus' time and even after it. And it wasn't just military insurrection or armed insurrection. There was homegrown terrorism taking place among the Jews. One group was called the Sicarii, the dagger men. And these men would walk around with daggers hidden underneath their cloaks. And from time to time, they would stab, hopefully to kill, people that they either thought were part of the occupying force or even collaborators among the Jews. And it was that same mentality, the belief that the only path forward was for them to overthrow the occupying force, force, that resistance in the form of armed conflict was the path forward. And so these men took it upon themselves to engage in this conflict, usually in the name of God. The apex of Jewish military resistance broke out in AD 66, in what is remembered as the Jewish War. This happened during a time of Roman disarray shortly after the death of Nero. The Jews saw this as an opportunity to take advantage of the Roman weakness and the lack of an emperor and raise up an army and fight back against the occupation. And they did. They raised up an army and pushed back against the Romans. The Romans, in response, sent in their legions under the command of a general named Vespasian, a man who during this time period was elevated to emperor. He began the Roman response to the Jewish war, and it was finished by his son Titus. Slowly but surely, the Roman legions defeated the Jews and pushed them back further and further into their territory. They finally ended up laying siege to the city of Jerusalem, and it was Titus who broke this siege and conquered them finally in this conflict. The city was sacked, and the temple was destroyed. And this is the last time the Jews were able to raise up any kind of a military resistance until around 133 AD, in what became known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. And it was at that time that once again they tried to fight back against the Romans. And in that conflict, the Romans crushed the Jews finally. They again sacked the city and expelled all the Jews from that city so that they were not even allowed to live there. And from that point on, they were unable to ever again try to revolt and resist Rome in any kind of a military fashion. If you look at the efforts and the objectives of both the Sadducees and the Zealots, what you find is, even though each group adopted a completely different set of tactics, neither was ultimately successful in their objectives. The Sadducees hoped to preserve their status, their power, their wealth. For them, the status quo was working, and so they collaborated with the occupying force, and hoped that they would be able to continue that indefinitely. In the end, they didn't. They lost the temple, they lost their positions, and the Sadducees essentially disappear from the record. On the flip side, the Zealots hoped to win their freedom, to get more than what they had in terms of their freedom and their ability to preserve their religion and their traditions. They believed that God was with them in their armed resistance. And in the end, they too failed. They were conquered by the Romans, Jerusalem was sacked, and the temple was destroyed. Not only did they fail in their objectives, they actually lost all that they had even before that. They came away with even less. Both collaboration and conflict ultimately proved fatal to these groups. So in the end, both groups lost what they hoped to preserve and what they hoped to gain. But I think there's even bigger tragedy to the story. Neither group saw what God was actually doing in their midst. Their efforts to preserve or to gain blinded them because they were trying to preserve and to gain things that were not in line with the project God was working on. God sent his Son into the world to establish a kingdom and to move forward in the plan that he had been working among them. But they didn't see it. Their efforts blinded them. And this is something that I think is important for us to recognize, because we may be tempted to collaborate with the powers around us. And by powers, I don't merely mean political powers. I mean powers of economics, powers of culture, powers that are moving the levers that move things in our society. And so it's politics, economics, or whatever. The temptation to collaborate with them to preserve or to do good may tempt us into that particular action. Or we may be tempted to overthrow them. We may see their corruption and we may see their oppression and say they need to be taken down in order to build something better, the way the Zealots tried to do. But we see that Jesus did not align with either one of them. He didn't embrace their goals. He didn't embrace their tactics because they were inconsistent with the kingdom project that God had sent him to do. And so, as we consider our own form of resistance, when we consider our own tactics in living under this time of occupation, we need to look to those two examples and say, neither one of them reflect God's kingdom and his righteousness. Neither one of them brought about the work that God was trying to do. And worst of all, those efforts blinded the people to what God was actually doing in their midst. And in the worst case scenario, made them enemies of God himself and his son Jesus.